Greetings and welcome to the Art Toronto virtual preview. My name is Kenneth Brummel. I am the Associate Curator of Modern Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and I am here seated with Jane Corkin, the owner and founder of Corkin Gallery in the Distillery District in the city of Toronto. Hi Jane, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Ken. So nice of you to be here today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And Jane and I today are in conversation. Jane, we're seated right now in the main hall of your gallery, the Corkin Gallery. If you'd be so kind as to give our viewers a sense of the history of your gallery and also the artists you've represented over the years.
Sure, thank you. The Corkin Gallery was established in 1979. In the early days, we showed photographs alongside painting and sculpture and other more traditional arts so that people could have an understanding of photography's place in the history. In those early days, back in the 80s and 90s, we had some great photographers who really are part of the most important history of 20th century, like André, Kertész, Harry Callahan, Irving Penn. They were all here at the gallery, Horst, Scavullo, Harry, Sarah Moon. When I think of even the lectures given by Nan Golden and many of the great photographers who really laid the foundation. But now today the gallery is interested in all arts, painting, sculpture, photography, and video. And we are thinking about modernism and how early 20th century influenced artists working today. Kenneth, when I think about it, I think of you being such a scholar in early 20th century and 20th century painting and sculpture, and I've been so pleased that you're here in the city. Your scholarship has added so much to what we know. And not only do I appreciate your scholarship, I appreciate how you bring it to the public in an understandable way. So thank you, and thank you for your contributions.
Well, thank you, Jane, for your contributions. You've been a fixture in this community since the late 70s, and your gallery has made significant contributions to the arts community, but also, I think, to the collecting community of photography, as you mentioned. And for you to sing my praises so enthusiastically, I think, is a compliment of the highest order, and I accept it and thank you, and it's an honor to be here with you today. And it's an honor to share your booth, which is what this installation is.
It is.
Entitled Accidental Geometries, with our Art Toronto audience. If you would be so kind as to give our audience a sense of what motivates this installation and why you're staging the juxtapositions you're staging.
Thank you for noticing all the different juxtapositions. I'm sure, of course, you noticed the Brancusi photograph.
Yes.
You were speaking of David Urban's work, and he is a mid-career artist, and yes, we have mid-career artists who people know in Toronto: David Urban, Leopold Plotek, Gino Rorei, Frank Mädler, and many artists who in different media have come together and really think about all of 20th century, whether it's painting or music.
What you've been able to do here, Jane, is you've taken early 20th century photography, particularly the Brancusi photograph, this original print from his studio, also this original print by André Kertész, and show how the formal experiments of these artists, these canonical artists of the 20th century, how they almost served as precursors for the artists you are displaying today.
Yeah, that's very true, Kenneth. Some of the artists like Plotek, like Urban, really looked at early 20th century artists like Leger, probably like Brancusi, because they are historians in their own right, and they think about art history in that way, and they think about how those artists work, what influenced them, and also, in the end, they produce their own idiom.
It's interesting you mentioned this, and I think, especially now with digital photography having had supplanted film photography, that especially younger collectors no longer understand the romance of the dark room.
Right.
Just as I think in painting, there's a romance of the studio, the artist in the studio working with materials, modifying materials, looking at their canvases, shuttling back and forth, making corrections. But I also think that when a photographer is generating prints in a dark room, there are some prints that are rejected simply because they failed. There are others that are kept. And when you're working with the original print, you get to see what features in the negative they wanted realized on the sheets. And when you're dealing with a posthumous print, or even something that is printed in a large edition, maybe 30 years later, that intimacy, or that romance, if we want to call it that, is just completely lost.
It really is different, you're right. And when you think of like artists like Frank Mädler, who are working in photography in a more modern way, and he is making his own color prints in darkrooms where it's not analog. I mean, it's analog, it's not digital, and it's still film, and it's like a continuous tone. You look at that photograph, it looks like a painting, and it looks like a painting because he's using the same kind of elements that painters think about in terms of where you place something on the canvas, or how objects in front and objects receding exchange with each other in space. And he's dealing with the flatness of a plane. He's dealing with you not really knowing what's going on in many of his pictures. And I think that kind of abstraction, it makes him in line with the painters who worked in his moment, which is now, of course.
And again, even in this installation, there are some really lovely juxtapositions. For example, next to the Mädler photograph, you have this lovely painting by Gina Rorei, and it's a view of trees outside of her window. And what you have are these vertical bands of color. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about why you're juxtaposing this view from a window with this photograph by Mädler.
It's so interesting. Well, as you notice, they're both trees. Gina Rorei made this painting during COVID time, so she was looking at the trees outside the park in her studio, and she's a great colorist. So she's a colorist of the first order. She's using trees in a very abstract way. At first, they just look like stripes, and then you begin to see they're kind of curtains, and behind the curtains, there's some formulation of what might be the bark on a tree. So that's a very lush, rich tree, as opposed to Mädler's tree, which, as you point out, is leafless. But I kind of like the juxtaposition, both in terms of one being very colorful and one having a very muted tonality.
But both are also quite literal paintings, but they're also quite ambiguous.
Quite ambiguous and quite abstract.
Yes, yes. And maybe for our audience, if you could describe why you juxtaposed the Barré collage here with the Brancusi studio photograph. What were you thinking when you brought those two objects together?
Well, we brought them together visually, I have to say, but they make sense, of course, because Brancusi was working in Paris when that photograph was made in the 20s. And of course, Vincent Barré also hails from Paris, France. He's a sculptor who has worked in Canada for many years ago. And he teaches in Paris at the Sorbonne, but his sculptures are seen throughout the city of Paris and the vineyards as well. But I'm sure Vincent has looked at Brancusi and the early artists who worked in sculpture in his city at that time. And again, he's a great historian who knows sculpture and painting history very well. And so you can understand from his work, one, while that's a collage on paper, you can understand very well he's a sculptor from how it comes together, and you can understand his appreciation of sculpture.
Yes, no, I think most certainly the way he manipulates paper, I think he has the sensibility of a sculptor, but also how he is able to at least think of felt space on a two-dimensional plane. I think it bespeaks his more sculptural predilection. What I noticed about your title, Accidental Geometries, it's very much in the surrealist vein in which André Kertész worked. Meaning André Breton, he defined surrealism as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on the operation table. So you just have this arbitrary collision of two objects that you would think have nothing to do with one another. And what you've done is you've brought together a photograph and a painting, things that maybe people normally do not hang together in a gallery. And now, by juxtaposing for example, Brancusi photograph with the work by Vincent Barré, people can see that there are indeed relationships. So when one walks into your gallery, Jane, one of the first works of art they will see is a diptych by David Urban. Perhaps you can let us know what your relationship with David Urban is, how long you've represented him, and why you are giving his diptych pride of place in your gallery.
David Urban is one of the great painters of our city, of our country. He's a great abstract painter, even a figurative abstraction, as sometimes we might call him. David Urban has been with us for many years, and one of the great things about David is that David is a painter's painter. David paints for himself, he paints for his audience, but he paints music, he paints literature. David is a Renaissance man who is always engaged in thinking about music and thinking about how to put music in paint on a canvas. And so his works become very layered and his works become very musical. So sometimes when you walk in the gallery and you see that diptych, I think you see it from 20 or 30 feet away, and it changes as you move closer to it.
And what I've noticed, as you know, at the Art Gallery of Ontario, we had a lot of diptychs and triptychs up when we had the Jean-Paul Riopel and Joan Mitchell exhibition. And
Yes.
Those are two artists who famously worked in multi-panel formats. And for me, what is most salient for me about David Urban, he has this predilection for geometry, but it's belied by his technique. His technique is this layering of touches, and you can see how gestural each of those touches are, and how he will allow either the wet on dry or the wet on wet. He's very sensitive to those properties of paint, but he's a very gestural painter, and he's obsessed with touch. But he, at the same time, is very geometric in terms of his overall compositions. And I enjoy the tension between those two impulses. And you also juxtapose with that painting a work by Plotek, which you were...
Well, with Leopold Plotek, because he paints in such a different manner. He also is someone who's very engaged in music and very engaged in literature. So they share being like Renaissance men in a way today so many people are not. So many people are slotted into one specific thing. But they share a love of the arts in a deep way. Plotek, however, paints very thinly, as you pointed out, and Plotek paints much more historically in a sense, doesn't he?
I would say yes, meaning he is definitely working in a long tradition of surrealism. He has these biomorphic, ambiguous forms that congeal into different figures, but those figures are never quite resolved, and they shift depending on how long you look at the canvas and what mood you might be in when you're looking at the canvas. And you also have in your booth, your display at your gallery in the Distillery District, a lovely work by Barbara Astman. And I know at the Art Gallery of Ontario, we own her archive.
Yeah,
and
great.
Perhaps maybe this monumental, I mean, it's quite a long photograph. It's a long format photograph, very long width. Maybe if you can explain to our Art Toronto viewers why you chose this, and what role does Barbara Astman play in the Corkin Gallery?
Thank you, Kenneth. Barbara Astman has been engaged, as you know, and has been at the forefront in changing technologies. She's also someone who's very interested in how media has informed how we as people think about our lives. Astman herself is a media junkie, she would call herself. She would sit with several newspapers at any one time and read many newspapers. And this is from her newspaper series. It was the result of collecting newspapers in her studio for a period of a year and piling up the newspapers all around the perimeter of her studio. And then the next year she went about photographing them.
It's interesting because we're in Toronto, and Toronto is the city of Marshall McLuhan, who famously mentioned how the medium is the message. And she's a photographer, but what she's trying to capture in her photography is the different sensory experience of print media as opposed to the more visual experience of the disembodied news that is delivered on a screen. Meaning
Absolutely.
it's a very different sensory consumption of information when you think of the printed page,
Right.
the printed newspaper, that one grasps with one hand and one turns pages, as you said, as opposed to the scrolling with one's finger and this consumption of light. meaning
Exactly.
it's ink you're consuming when you're reading a newspaper, but now we're fed news through the medium of light on a screen.
So she's been in the forefront of digital techniques over the last 40 years in her making of art, and has always been at the forefront in employing these techniques.
I want to encourage our viewers who are enjoying this Art Toronto virtual preview. I want you to come to the Jane Corkin Gallery. I want you to enjoy this exquisite installation of historical photographs and contemporary painting, but also mid-century collages by Vincent Barré. And I also want to encourage our audience to enjoy the other videos that are a part of the Art Toronto virtual preview. And I also want to thank Art Toronto, who has been a partner of the Art Gallery of Ontario for 21 years. But I also want to thank Jane Corkin for inviting me to your exquisite gallery here in the Distillery District, and for inviting me to have this conversation with you about your booth, which is here at your gallery, and which, again, I hope everyone will visit.
Thank you, Kenneth, and thank you so much for being here with us, and thank the Art Gallery of Ontario for its great sponsorship of Art Toronto and for being such great supporters of art in our city.